The thin wall between the stockroom and Diane's office had never kept sound out with any thoroughness. Nora knew this. She had been aware of it for 4 years, long enough to have trained herself not to listen, the way you train yourself not to hear a neighbor's television through an apartment wall. The habit was so established that for the first 2 seconds she was not registering the words at all, only the familiar texture of Diane's voice moving through the wall, unhurried, unguarded, aimed at someone else. Then the words arranged themselves. Her mother cleaned houses in this town. A brief pause. That is what she comes from, and that is all she will ever be. Nora's hand was already on the folder. She did not pick it up. She stood in the specific kind of stillness that is not peace, but the closest thing to it when peace is not available. And she looked at the wall, and she let the sentence finish its work inside her. Then she took the folder. She turned off the light and walked back to the counter. 3 weeks before that evening, she had been standing at the same counter when the front door opened and let in a gust of March cold, and a man she had never seen. Barrett's Falls sat in the folded kind of valley geography that kept small towns small. Hills on 3 sides, one road in from the north and one from the south, the kind of arrangement that made leaving feel deliberate and staying feel like the path of least resistance. In early March, the hills still held snow in the crease lines of the ridges, and the single stoplight on the main block swung on its cable in the gap wind and threw red and green across the wet pavement below in an order that had not changed in Nora's memory. The Barrett name was on the park pavilion and the gymnasium wing of the elementary school, and the carved stone above the doorway of the building where Nora spent 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 48 weeks of the year. She had understood the name as a kind of geological feature for as long as she could remember, something that shaped the landscape without being attributable to any living person. The family had managed its holdings through an attorney in the city for so long that nobody Nora knew had ever met a Barrett in the flesh. The name was architecture. It was the town's original claim on itself. Some mornings in winter, when the frost made the carved letters catch the early light, she traced them with her eyes while she was waiting for the lock to cooperate. The key sometimes stiff in the cold brass plate until she worked it through. Holt's Provisions was not Diane's building. She leased it, had leased it for 11 years, and ran it with the settled authority of someone who had been in one place long enough to mistake duration for ownership. The store carried dry goods, pharmacy staples, local produce in season, and a back counter with coffee from 6 in the morning that had been available in that spot since well before Diane's tenure and would probably outlast it. The counter was Nora's. She had taken the job 4 years ago when the machine shop in the next valley closed, and she had spent 3 months looking for work that matched her hours and the drive she could manage. She had been good at it from the first week. Diane had registered this goodness and then stopped mentioning it, which was how Diane handled things that worked. Behind the counter there were 2 coffee urns, and beside the register a receipt spindle worn smooth at the base, where Nora's palm rested against it each morning, and taped to the cabinet facing a small laminated sheet listing the Callaway account codes in Nora's own handwriting from 2 years before. She kept the surface clean and the display jars in order and the pens in the cup by the register. None of it required instruction anymore. Diane's corrections were not dramatic. They were the corrections of someone who had organized the world into tiers and ran a running account of where everyone stood. And Nora stood where she had always stood, able, present, and below the line of anyone whose standing Diane found worth cultivating. When Diane handed Nora a task and said please, it was the please of someone who did not expect to be refused. When she mentioned Nora to a mutual acquaintance, she used a tone that was warm and slightly protective, and managed to imply, without quite saying, that Nora was doing reasonably well, given what she had to work with. Nora's mother, Ruth, had spent 20 years cleaning houses in the valley before her knees required her to stop. She had done it conscientiously and without complaint, and had raised Nora to understand that there was no work worth doing that was not worth doing correctly. Ruth was retired now, lived 3 miles up the valley road, still kept the neatest house Nora had ever been inside. Diane had known Ruth in the professional sense, the way you knew the person who kept your baseboards clean. This history sat between Nora and Diane like a piece of furniture. Neither of them had placed there, and neither of them acknowledged. Mavis Oaks came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays for coffee and a particular brand of crackers that no other store in the valley carried. Nora had started keeping a box below the counter on the in-between days because the display rotation was slower than Mavis's appetite, and she saw no reason to make her ask. Mavis was 78 and had been coming to the store when it was still called Barrett's old place by the people with long enough memories, and she delivered her opinions with a directness that Nora found genuinely restful after a day spent navigating Diane's precision. She had known Ruth for decades. She regarded Nora with the particular affection of someone who had watched a family persist through one difficulty after another, and had drawn her own conclusions about what that said. Mavis was not in the store the morning Thomas came in. The door opened at 7:43. Nora knew the time because she had just checked the clock above the coffee station, a reflex she had on slow mornings. The man who came through the door was carrying a paper map, folded into a rough square, and wearing a canvas work jacket faded along the shoulders from weather rather than wear. He stopped just inside and looked at the store without hurry, not the way tourists catalogue things, but the way someone looks at a space they are trying to place accurately. Then he came to the counter. He said he was looking for the county records office. He had been told it was in the town hall, but the town hall was locked. He put the map on the counter and pointed to an address penciled in the upper corner and asked if she knew the street. The paper was worn soft at the fold lines, gone thin where it had been opened and refolded in the cold that morning. Nora looked at the address and told him the county records were not in the town hall. They were in the annex behind it, separate entrance off the east alley. She told him the town hall usually opened at 9, but the annex had someone in by 8:30 on most mornings, and if he was after land records specifically, Barb Tanner was the one to ask for, and Barb was generally first in. He listened without interrupting. He folded the map along its original creases and put it back in his jacket pocket. He said, "Thank you," and the particular way he said it, attending to the words rather than just producing them, made her notice that she had actually been of use to him rather than simply in his way. She did not ask what property he was reviewing. He did not offer it. He was back the following morning, and the morning after that. By the end of that first week, she had begun setting out 2 cups before the door opened, and she was not thinking about this particularly. It was simply an efficiency, but she was doing it. On the 4th morning, she had his cup already in place when he came through the door, and he looked at it, and then at her, and she was already turning to the next task without comment. She learned his name on the 5th morning because she asked, and knowing the name of someone who came in every day seemed like a reasonable piece of information to have. He said Thomas. He said it plainly, the way people say a name when they are not performing it. She told him hers, and he said it once quietly, carefully, as if placing it somewhere specific, and she noticed the care in that even as she was turning to fill his cup. Over the following days she noticed other things. The quality of stillness in his hands when he was waiting, the way he asked questions assuming she would know the answer rather than wondering if she might. One hand rested flat on the counter beside his cup when he was reading, the fingers easy rather than restless. The jacket had a hardware supplier's name on the chest pocket, but had never carried the kind of load that would have stained it. He had been in town for over a week, reviewing a property he had not named, and she had not asked, and in those 10 days he had told her nothing about himself beyond his first name and the fact of his errand. Mavis came in on a Tuesday in his second week. Nora had the crackers on the counter before Mavis was through the door. Mavis came to the counter and her eyes went to Thomas, standing 2 stools down with the property map unrolled at his elbow, and her expression did the thing Nora had seen it do when Mavis was working out a connection. A slight, careful pause, like a card player who has seen a familiar suit. "Who's your friend?" Mavis said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "His name's Thomas," Nora said, "in town for a property review." Mavis looked at him again, briefly. Thomas was studying the map. Mavis said in the particular register she used when she had filed something and was not ready to say what it was, and she took her crackers and her cup to the corner stool and said nothing more. She sat with her back straight as she always did, the cracker box resting unopened on the stool beside her, and she watched the room with the patience of someone who has learned that certain things will arrange themselves in their own time. The afternoons in the second week ran differently from the first. Thomas stayed later, not in a manner that required explanation, since he had documents sometimes spread across the counter, and the annex had limited hours, but he was there when the 4 o'clock customers came in, and still there when they thinned out. Twice, reaching for the receipt holder at the same moment, they both stopped, their hands in the air on either side of the space between them. The receipt holder was a chrome cylinder gone dull at the rim from years of use, and in the 2 seconds they both held still, she was aware of the nearness of his hand, close enough that the warmth of it registered, before either of them moved. The second time she looked up, and he was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it needed to. She was the one who moved first, taking the receipts and turning back to the customer waiting. Her face held its usual expression, level, present, unhurried. She was aware in some quiet peripheral way that her heartbeat had registered the moment before the rest of her had caught up. It was on a Thursday in the third week, when the store was holding its particular 4 o'clock fullness, that Diane came out from the back room. 2 women from the insurance office were waiting on their orders. A man from the garage was reading the notice board. A woman with a child in a stroller was taking her time in the produce section. Thomas was at the far end of the counter with his cup and a page of handwritten notes. Diane came through the back door carrying the price tag dispenser and crossed behind Nora to reach the eastern shelf. She looked at the receipt Nora had just written for the garage man and said, in the tone of a correction being repeated, "You're still not carrying the decimal on even dollar amounts. I've mentioned it." "I'll watch it," Nora said. She kept her voice even and her hands moving. "The bags," Diane continued, still at the shelf. "You've been doubling the paper bags again. That's a cost." "I'll mind it." "And the Callaway order Tuesday came in 2 crates short. Did you mark it in?" "I marked it on the intake form. I noted the shortage there." "You could have called for same-day delivery on the balance. That's a week of missing inventory." "I didn't have the authorization code to call on the account," Nora said. "I asked you for it in August." Diane said nothing for 2 full seconds, which was the tell that the line of argument had come to its natural end. Then she said, "I'll get you the code," and walked back toward the office. The price tag dispenser clicked once against the shelf edge as she turned. The garage man accepted his bag without making eye contact, the way people did when they had witnessed something they had not chosen to witness. The insurance women had found something interesting on their phones. The woman with the stroller was studying a granola bar label with complete attention. Thomas, at the far end of the counter, was looking at the coffee menu board. Nora put the next customer's order together and said the amount and made change. She did not look at Thomas. He did not look at her. She did not feel anything she would have named as particular. She had felt this before in one form or another for 4 years, and the way through it was to keep moving. She kept moving. He stayed until the store closed. She became aware of this gradually, as the afternoon customers thinned and the early evening regulars came and went, and each time she turned from a task, he was still at the far end with his notes. The windows greyed out before the overhead fluorescence registered the shift, and the store settled into its end-of-day configuration. Counterlit, far shelves receding into a softer dark. When the last customer left at 5:50, she was wiping down the counter, and he was still there, his cup empty, his notes folded and tucked into the jacket pocket. He said he had not meant to still be there. She said people stayed when the work held them. He said he thought that was true. He paid for a second coffee he had not drunk and left, and she watched the door settle closed behind him, and then looked at the counter where his cup had been, and finished the wipe down. She stood for a moment with her cloth in her hand and nothing else going on. She was thinking about the morning count. She was also aware, somewhere adjacent to that thought, that the afternoon had not felt as long as afternoons usually did, and she was aware enough of that to notice it and set it down without looking at it too carefully. She was in the stockroom at 6:30 the following evening, a Friday, pulling the end-of-week tally sheet from its folder, when she heard the office door close across the narrow hall, and then Diane's voice carrying through the old wood panel wall with the ease of someone who had stopped thinking about who else might still be in the building. "She'll think she's due a review," Diane said. "Come March." A muffled response from her husband. "I'll let her go in the fall." The voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of someone tidying a column in a ledger. "I've been thinking about it for 6 months. Bring in a part-time and split the hours. Save the difference." Nora's hand had gone still on the folder. Her mother cleaned houses in this town. Diane's voice and the sound of the office chair settling under her weight. That is what she comes from, and that is all she will ever be. The sentence took 4 seconds. Nora counted this without meaning to, the way the body counts things the mind does not want to attend to directly. The tally folder was light in her hand, the cardboard cover gone soft at the corners from 4 years of Friday handling, and the stockroom held its usual single bulb in the overhead fixture and its smell of cardboard and old coffee grounds from the open bags on the lower shelf. She thought about her mother. Ruth had spent 20 years in other people's houses, on her hands and knees on other people's floors, and she had come home in the evenings with reddened hands and made dinner and called it a trade, because that is what it was, an honest trade, a thing she was good at, a thing the town had needed someone to do well and do quietly. Ruth had never described her work as anything but what it was. She had passed this to Nora without ceremony, not as a lesson, but as an understood fact. There was no decent work that did not deserve a person's full attention, and she had given it. Every morning she had gotten up and gone to do it. Nora took the tally folder from the shelf. She turned off the stockroom light. She walked back to the counter and finished the count, column by column, the way she had done it every Friday for 4 years running. Her face was what it always was. The store was very still around her. Outside, the evening had gone dark enough that the carved letters on the limestone lintel were no longer legible from the inside, just a shape against the sky, old and patient, spelling out a name that belonged to someone she had never met. She locked the store at 6:15, the key making its familiar stiff half-turn in the cold brass plate before the bolt found its seat. She walked to her car in the dark, the cold sharp enough to show her breath, her steps loud on the empty brick sidewalk in a way they never were during the day when the street held noise enough to absorb them. She drove the 3 miles north without the radio. Her mother's kitchen light was on. Nora could see it from the road, a warm rectangle in the dark hillside, and the porch light too, a small circle above the painted concrete steps. She did not stop. Ruth would be reading, or finishing the dishes, or watching the news. She kept on for company, and Nora had nothing she wanted to say tonight that she could say cleanly. She pulled into her own driveway and sat with the engine off. The car ticked as it cooled. Through the windshield the yard was dark, the bare limbs of the old maple in the corner just visible against the slightly lighter sky. The sentence was in her, the way something gets in when you have tried not to let it. Completely. She had known, she supposed, in the way you know things you are not yet ready to look at directly, that Diane's accounting of her ran along those lines. Knowing it and hearing it said, plainly, into the air, without apology, were not the same thing, and she had never found a way to make them be. She was inside by 7 and in bed by 9. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, the water stain near the window oval and gone pale from years of dryness, and thought about what the morning required, which was the same as what every morning required. The alarm at 5:45, the coffee, the drive-in, the key in the lock at 6:30 because the coffee needed to be ready before the first customer. Ray Pelletier from the garage, who took 2 sugars and had not missed a weekday in the years she had worked the morning shift. She had looked after that for 4 years. She would look after it in the morning. She turned on her side and she slept. The alarm went at 5:45. She made coffee, drove in, parked in the alley. The morning was cold, the sky the particular grey-white of early April that could not decide between cloud and clearing. She came around to the main entrance because the alley door had a lock that required patience she did not always have before 6:30, and she stopped. Thomas was sitting on the step, not leaning against the doorframe the way someone leans who has just arrived and is checking their watch. Sitting, his back against the frame, his jacket collar up against the cold, in the posture of someone who has been there long enough to have settled into it. His breath was showing in the cold air, slow and steady, and there was a paper cup from the gas station 2 blocks north on the step beside him, the lid peeled back, already finished. She felt him before she had fully registered what she was seeing. A warmth in the chest, a small shift in how she was moving, her step adjusting slightly. She noticed the adjustment and did not chase it. She said, "Good morning." He stood, brushing the back of his jacket with one hand. He said he had been in the neighborhood. She looked at him. The street behind him was empty, the buildings dark, the earliest light still finding its way between the hills. He was not in the neighborhood. There was no neighborhood at 6:20 in the morning. There was only intention. She did not say this. She unlocked the door, and he held it while she went through, and she went behind the counter and turned on the lights and started the coffee. He sat at the counter and set his empty gas station cup on the edge, out of the way. She set the water and measured the grounds and got the first filter running. The coffee machine began its particular low gurgle, and the smell of it moved through the cold store the way it did every morning, filling the space before the light had fully warmed it, before the street noise had started. She was watching the first dark thread of it find the carafe below. Neither of them said anything for a moment that held a different quality from the silences of the previous 3 weeks, which had been the silences of 2 people sharing a space. This one was the silence of 2 people who had both arrived at something and were standing on its near edge. He said, "Were you all right last evening?" She was watching the coffee begin its run. She gave the question the honesty it seemed to require. "I was all right," she said. "I've been all right for a while." He did not answer immediately. Then, "That is not quite the same thing as things being as they should be." She looked at him. He was looking at the counter, at the grain of the old wood. His hands were flat on its surface, easy and still. "No," she said. "It isn't." The store filled in the usual order. Ray came in at 7:15 for his 2 sugars, set his work gloves on the counter while he waited, picked them up again when she slid his cup across. He said nothing about Thursday, and neither did she. The insurance women came at 8, pulling their scarves off as they came through the door, their voices overlapping before they reached the counter. The bread delivery came at 8:30, the driver propping the door with his hip to manage the flat and signing the intake sheet with the same thick pen he always used, the cap held in his teeth. Thomas stayed at the end of the counter, and twice Diane came through from the back, and both times she managed the transaction of his presence the way she managed things she had decided not to address, briefly and with full attention elsewhere. Thomas said at some point in the late morning that his business with the county records was concluded. The review had taken about as long as he had expected. "Will you go then?" Nora said. "There are a few things still outstanding." She looked at him to see if there was more to that sentence. His expression was level and unhurried, the same expression he had worn since the morning she directed him to the annex behind the town hall. She turned back to the customer at the register. The outstanding things kept him in Barrett's Falls for 3 more days. He came in each morning. The map had stayed in his pocket since the end of the 2nd week, and he no longer had papers to spread across the counter, but the habit of the stool had become itself a reason, and neither of them examined it. On Tuesday morning, Mavis came through the door. The bell above it was the original fixture, brass gone green at the mounting bracket, and its tone had dropped lower than it had been when Nora started, the clapper wearing loose with years. Nora had the crackers on the counter before Mavis reached the register. Mavis accepted this with the nod of someone accustomed to being anticipated correctly, and she took the stool 2 down from Thomas, as she always did when both corners were occupied, and poured her own coffee from the pour-over Nora had set out. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at Thomas. He looked up from the counter. Something moved across Mavis's face. Not quite recognition, because recognition implies uncertainty resolved. This was closer to confirmation, the face of someone who has been waiting for a clear enough look and now has had it. She said, "You're Robert's son." Thomas went still. Mavis said it the way she said everything, plainly, with the weight of someone who has earned the right to speak plainly by having paid attention for 78 years. "You have his way of sitting. He used to sit exactly like that when he was working something out. I knew your father from the planning board. In 2003, he was a decent man." Nora looked at Thomas. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at Mavis, and in the 3 seconds it took him to decide what to say, Nora's eye moved to the side of the store where Diane had stopped beside the eastern shelf with the price tag dispenser in her hand, not moving, her head angled towards the counter. Thomas said, "Yes, I'm Thomas Barrett." The name fell into the store the way a familiar thing falls when it lands in an unfamiliar place. Not loudly, but with an unmistakable weight. The 2 customers at the far end of the counter looked up. The woman choosing between 2 cans of tomatoes in the middle aisle paused without realizing she was pausing. Nora looked at him. She looked at the carved lintel above the front door, visible from inside if you knew to look, the letters reversed but legible through the glass. She looked back at Thomas. He was watching her with the particular steadiness he had brought to every morning at this counter for 3 weeks, except that now there was something else in it, a careful attention, not anxious, but present in a way that had not been fully visible before. He had been watching for exactly this moment, and what he was watching for was not her surprise, but the first honest reaction, unguarded before she could put anything else over it. She set down the cup she was holding. She said, "How long?" "Since the day you sent me to the annex." She thought about the county map folded into its rough square, the address penciled in the upper corner, the way he had folded it back along its original creases, as if he had done it many times before and knew exactly how it went. She thought about his father, who had been on the planning board in 2003 and whom she had never met, and about his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather, whose name was carved above the door. She walked through 5 days a week, 48 weeks of the year. Diane was still at the eastern shelf. She had not moved. The price tag dispenser was still in her hand, its plastic body yellow and worn at the grip where it had been held and set down and held again over 11 years of use. Nora became aware of this the way she had been aware of the whole scene, from the outside in, fitting the pieces together without drama. Diane had heard Thomas say his name. Diane had, in the pause between one breath and the next, begun to understand what she had been doing for 3 weeks and what she had said on a Friday evening through a wall she had miscalculated. Mavis had her hands around her coffee cup and was watching all of this with the patience of someone who has been in rooms when understanding arrives and knows there is nothing to do but let it complete itself. Thomas turned on his stool to face the whole of the store, not performing anything, just no longer at any particular angle. Diane set the dispenser on the shelf, the click of it sharp in the quiet room. She walked back behind the counter. Mr. Barrett. Her voice was careful in the way a voice is careful when it is finding its own flaw. I hope you found the building to your satisfaction. I have, he said. The annex had everything I needed. And the lease renewal. She said it the way you say a thing you are still processing even as you say it. Through the trust. The attorney will handle the paperwork. The terms are as they have been. The store held a particular stillness. The 2 customers at the far end rearranged their attention toward their phones and their cups. The woman in the middle aisle had chosen a can and moved on. Ray Pelletier had come in at some point during the last few minutes and was reading the notice board with a thoroughness that did not match his usual pace. His work gloves folded over his belt, his coffee going cool on the window ledge beside him. Nora was watching Diane. She had expected to feel something specific, and instead she felt mostly clear. The particular clarity that comes not from winning, but from a space that has finally said what it actually was. The floor that had shifted under her in the stockroom on Friday evening had not shifted back. It had settled into a new arrangement, and now everything in the room was standing on that arrangement, and it held. Diane looked at Nora. There was, for a second, something in Diane's face that was not contempt and not apology. It was closer to a kind of accounting. A woman running her ledger and finding that the column she had been adding was wrong, not by a rounding error, but from the first number. I'll get you the authorization code for the Callaway account, Diane said. She said it to the counter. Before end of day. Thank you, Nora said. Diane went through the back door. The sound of her footsteps crossed the storeroom floor and faded. Mavis finished her coffee. She tucked the crackers into her bag and stood, straightening her coat, smoothing the collar flat with both hands. She said to Nora, Your mother made the best lemon cake in the valley. She brought one to my husband's funeral, and I still think about it. She paused with her hand on the strap of her bag. I thought you might want to know someone thinks about it. She walked out. The bell above the door settled. Nora was still for a moment. She thought about her mother's kitchen on baking days, the smell of butter and lemon rind and the close warmth of the oven, and Ruth's hands setting a cake on a neighbour's table, the same way she set everything down, completely, without reservation, as if the giving was simply another kind of work worth doing correctly. Thomas stayed until the afternoon rush thinned. Nora moved through the day in the usual order. The counts, the restock, the receipts carried at the even decimal. The Callaway authorization code appeared on a slip of paper at 3 o'clock. Diane's handwriting, the numbers small and neat, slid across the counter without eye contact. Nora said, "Thank you." Diane went back to the office. At 4:30, when the last of the afternoon customers had gone and the store held only the low hum of the cooler and the sound of the street through the glass, Thomas set his cup down. "Did you ever know my family?" he said. "Before." She thought about the question honestly. "I knew your name on buildings," she said. "I used to read the lintel in the frost, mornings when the lock was slow. That's the full accounting of it." He was quiet for a moment. The cooler cycled through its low hum. Outside, a car passed on the main block, its tires quiet on the wet pavement. "Then you have been in this town your whole life," he said, "and you have read my family's name more carefully than any of us have read it ourselves. There is something I would very much like to change about that." He said it the way he said everything. One sentence, no surplus, the words meaning exactly what they said and nothing more and nothing less. She looked at him. She thought about her mother in other people's houses, on her hands and knees on other people's floors, coming home with reddened hands and calling it a trade and being right about that. She thought about the town named for a family she had never met, and how that name had always felt like geography, impersonal and old. She thought about 3 weeks of mornings, and the specific quality of being attended to by someone who was not measuring what he gave against what he judged her worth. "I'd like that too," she said. Outside, the April light was doing what it did on clear evenings when the days had finally stretched past endurance, pulling the last gold out of limestone and old brick and the carved letters above the door, warming the whole face of the building for a few minutes in a way it would not repeat until the next clear evening. Nora looked at the counter. She looked at the receipt she had written and not yet filed. She looked at the lettering above the door, the way she had looked at it on the slowest winter mornings, following the cut of each letter with her eyes while the lock cooperated at its own pace. She had traced those letters for 4 years. She had read them in frost and in afternoon light, and at the end of long days when she was locking up alone, and they had been architecture. They had been the town's original claim on itself. They had meant nothing personal, and they had asked nothing of her. And she had given them her full attention anyway, the way she gave everything her full attention, because that was the thing her mother had passed to her, not as a lesson, but as an understood fact. There was no decent work that did not deserve a person's full attention, and she had given it. Every morning she had gotten up and come here and done it. She filed the receipt. She wiped down the counter, the full length of it, the way she did every evening. She straightened the coffee station and turned off the lights in the order she always turned them off. Back to front, the counter last. Thomas held the door while she went through. She stepped out onto the front step and turned and looked up at the lintel, the way she always did. The gold had gone out of it. The letters were back to their patient grey, spelling out the name of a family that had shaped this valley for 3 generations, and that she understood now, only just beginning to know. She put her hand on the doorframe, the worn wood smooth under her fingers, and she pulled it closed behind her.